Story 1. If religious organizations can support candidates and still keep tax exemptions, they are gaining influence without paying the price. The distinction becomes unclear when private beliefs begin to influence public policy. Story 2. The endorsement ban is not for religious organizations. It applies to 501(c)(3) nonprofit organizations, which is how most religious organizations are incorporated. Story 3. Roughly in the same way as any other organized group of people. Any organized group of people will endorse policies, lobbyists, and politicians proportionally to their wealth and influence. The limit is just blurry because who should not be a politician? Anyone religious? Anyone involved in their religious community? Anyone who used to have a religious role? Anyone that any priest openly supports? Story 4. The Establishment Clause of the Constitution prohibits the government from showing preference toward one religion over another. It does not prohibit religious institutions from voicing their beliefs about the government. Story 5. What part of the line between religion and government, as implemented by the Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, is crossed when religious organizations express their political opinions? Story 6. The First Amendment essentially states that there will be no laws concerning religion. Therefore, why would a religious organization not be allowed to endorse anyone they choose? This is the same freedom other nonprofit organizations, such as labor unions, enjoy. Singling out a religious organization and threatening to punish it or strip its nonprofit status for voicing an opinion on a candidate would be a direct violation of the Constitution. This would be enforcing a law that does not otherwise exist on an organization solely because it is religious. Story 7. The First Amendment prohibits the state from establishing a religion as the state religion. Tax exemption status does not establish a religion as the state religion. An argument could arise if only a specific religion were tax exempt. Tax exemption traditionally aims to keep the government from being involved in religious institutions. In the case of the Johnson Amendment of Internal Revenue Service tax codes, the court has ruled that when speaking to a congregation at worship, the speech is protected as if it were a head of a family speaking to the family at dinner. The state should not restrict that by punishing individuals through loss of tax exemption status. This ruling affects all 501(c) organizations, not just religious institutions. Story 8. When a religious group endorses a candidate, they are basically saying, "This candidate supports policies consistent with our beliefs." That is not scandalous. Non-religious organizations do the same thing. Drawing a line between church and state can be difficult. As various political theorists, most notably Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, and especially de Tocqueville, have pointed out over the years, laws are legislated morality, an explicit social contract governing society. For example, outlawing murder only makes sense if you believe murder is wrong. That is why there are debates such as pro-life versus pro-choice. Pro-life people believe that a person's a person, no matter how small, hence abortion is murder. Pro-choice people believe that fetuses are not people yet, and therefore killing them is not murder. Legislation consistent with one group's beliefs will necessarily go against the others. This is what de Tocqueville referred to as the tyranny of the majority. Insofar as we must draw a line of separation, I tend to agree with Hobbes that it should be between public and private affairs. In terms of people's public lives, the interactions between them and others, the social contract will inevitably codify moral beliefs. However, the government has no business interfering in private beliefs, for example, whether you choose to eat pork. This is the position that American jurisprudence has generally taken in the past as well. There is still some indeterminacy. For example, what about things like drug abuse, which, though private, have negative societal effects? But I cannot think of a way to eliminate this gray zone without going too far in either direction. Story 9. Religious organizations are nonprofit organizations. All nonprofit organizations are allowed to endorse political candidates and retain their tax-exempt status. Story 10. I'm fine with it. I think this is one of those controversies that gets blown way out of proportion because people want to score cheap political victories at great cost to democratic principles. As a question of fundamental fairness, if we want nonprofit organizations near and dear to the left to be unmolested, we should be willing to bear the same from religious nonprofit organizations that the right favors. It's also a case where First Amendment rights are conflicting with First Amendment rights, free speech versus separation of church and state. This is always a muddy gray area where some balance needs to be struck. Both Planned Parenthood and the Catholic Church should be able to endorse candidates. I feel like a lot of the arguments on this issue are in bad faith and really just desire a policy outcome where only one of those is true. Story 11. We do not. Therefore, we should reconsider tax-exempt status. Everyone and everything should be tax-exempt. Story 12. Congregations have hosted candidates and their spouses frequently over the last 40 years without offering shared time to both parties, and nothing has affected their tax-exempt status. The actions today reflect the status quo. To be fair, the British at the time of the Revolution called it the Presbyterian Revolt. Make of that what you will. Story 13. So Jeff Bezos can now make a 100% tax-deductible contribution to his church and support any candidate or cause he wants in any amount with no reporting. Story 14. Lines like that tend to evaporate when crossed if corrective action is not taken immediately. So I am not sure there is a place to draw it anymore without rectifying that situation. Story 15. That's a great question. It is also the issue that conservatives have been trying to obscure since creationism was banned in public schools. Story 16. In this administration, with this Republican congressional majority and this Supreme Court, we do not draw lines. Vote. Story 17. That is because the Republican Party is not concerned with whom religious institutions will tell their members to vote for. As soon as Pope Leo says to vote for the Democratic Party, that will change. Story 18. Same as we draw the line between Christian and non-Christian, except for those Christian churches who defy former President Donald Trump, of course. Story 19. Do not think a religious organization should be endorsing individual politicians. Consider what they could do. Provide members of the congregation with nonpartisan information about election issues. Organize voter registration drives. Host candidates as speakers, ensuring each candidate on the ballot has an equal opportunity to participate. Hold discussions about the relationship between church doctrine and ballot issues. Story 20. Since a large portion of politicians have dual citizenship, I would say that is a bigger problem than a church endorsing a candidate or party, unless that religion is also integral to the dual citizenship. Story 21. I would say religious charter schools, but our state superintendent keeps trying to push for a Catholic charter school. I am Catholic, but I feel like religious charter schools are a bad idea. What if Scientologists open a charter school? Do we want public funding going to that? Story 22. That is the great thing we cannot. We are eroding our constitution and laws day by day, and nobody seems to care. Hide your kids, hide your wives, and hide your husbands. They are harming everybody out here. Story 23. I am religious in a way that some social media platforms may not appreciate, but I must say I do not want pressure from my congregation to endorse a particular candidate. If I knew that God had endorsed a certain candidate, I would endorse that candidate. But I do not know that, and God does not actually endorse candidates. The Bible endorses certain values and condemns others, and no candidate meets all of those values while failing none, so a judgment call must be made. If Jesus is the great king, and being king is a function of government, I find it difficult to imagine Jesus wanting a government where poor children do not receive food because of concerns about disadvantaging the wealthy. Story 24. It is clear. The Constitution does not allow for a state church. There is no problem with religious beliefs being present in the government. A religion can freely support whoever they choose. If there were an American pope, he could be elected president. The Constitution guarantees freedom of religion. The government cannot tell you which church to attend or not attend. There is no freedom from religion. Story 25. The line has not existed in my lifetime, for as long as I am able to remember. I am almost 40 years old. Story 26. You cannot draw any lines with this administration. They have the power to do whatever they want. It is the United States versus them. Get out and vote in the 2026 midterm elections to take our country back. Story 27. Yes. The kingdoms in Europe and Asia were often aligned with religion. This is where certain political groups think they want us to go. Story 28. I am guessing you are talking about the United States. It seems like you do not anymore, and it is more and more woven into your political fabric. Sadly, how the mighty have fallen. Story 29. Trump receives significant campaign contributions from fundamentalist Christian groups determined to convince the world that God is so weak he needs to be in the White House to control events. In a democracy, the government is supposed to serve the people it governs. This cannot happen if the government assumes that God has already written all the laws and it is only up to humans to enforce them. Religion often brings out the best in people, as it does in many parts of the world, but no one should mistakenly believe that religion guarantees morality. Story 30. You are never going to have a complete and utter separation of church and state. I mean, how would you? Are you going to ban religious people from holding office? Story 31. There is no separation anymore. The separation of church and state is dead, and our founding fathers are turning in their graves. Story 32. I do not vote or endorse anyone because all available options support Israel. It would be preferable to be tax-exempt and not have to pay for Israel. Story 33. I have no idea. In my country, sponsoring a political party is illegal. For us, it is bribery. The same applies to religion. It is a matter of private life, not public life. If a pastor, priest, or any religious leader tries to give a sermon with political overtones, speaking positively or negatively of a party or candidate, it is illegal. Story 34. En teoría, las organizaciones exentas de impuestos no deberían hacer campaña política directa. El problema es que muchas lo hacen indirectamente y no hay suficiente supervisión. Ahí es donde se difumina la línea entre iglesia y Estado. Story 35. If people have freedom of religion, the freedom to peaceably assemble, and freedom of speech, then people who peaceably assemble in groups to practice their religion have freedom of speech too. Being taxed or not taxed does not take away your fundamental rights. Story 36. How would this affect all the other non-profit organizations that endorse candidates? Environmental, gun, and other groups also endorse candidates. Story 37. Separation of church and state was a 1920s court ruling. It was never in the United States Constitution. Several federal laws state that secular employers cannot discriminate based on religion. The First Amendment says the government cannot interfere with the free exercise of religion, which makes it tax-exempt, or have an established official tax-supported church as England, Ireland, Germany, and many other nations do. The 14th Amendment applied the First Amendment to state and local governments. Story 38. Ironically, the government generally does not endorse candidates. Elected representatives represent the people in government, not the government itself. Story 39. I do not like it, but my assumption is that it would be difficult to police. What constitutes endorsement? Who is considered the official voice of a religion? Certainly, if the Pope did it, that is one thing, but I can see this line getting blurry. Story 40. They are trying to erase that line. However, with the Catholic Church opposing the bipartisan infrastructure law and immigration and customs enforcement, that may not work out as they would like. Story 41. The line was drawn in the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That is the line and nothing else. It restricts the government, not the people or religion. Political parties are tax-exempt, and they promote and endorse candidates all the time. Story 42. That's a deep question. The line between religion and government is supposed to be clear, based on the idea of separation of church and state. In the United States, religious organizations are generally prohibited from endorsing political candidates if they want to keep their tax-exempt status. This is part of the Johnson Amendment. The goal is to prevent religious groups from becoming political powerhouses. However, there is ongoing debate about how strictly this is enforced and what counts as an endorsement. It is a tricky balance between free speech and maintaining that separation. Story 43. The First Amendment is a one-way street. It restricts what laws the government can pass. Cannot pass laws restricting speech, and it cannot pass laws about religion. It does not prevent people from doing anything. Religious organizations can endorse political candidates for the same reason you can. This question displays a deep misunderstanding of nearly every aspect of public life. People with religious beliefs can influence government because they are people. But the government cannot establish official religions, outlaw religions, or regulate religious practices beyond the same safety and order regulations that apply to all activities. These tax laws only violate freedom of religion incidentally. The truth is, they violate freedom of speech. For government regulation to impose a penalty or otherwise treat an entity differently based on the content of its speech is obviously a violation of freedom of speech. This applies to an organization like Planned Parenthood as much as it does to a church. Where do we draw the line? Where it has always been. Government cannot impose regulations on speech. This is the same issue as Citizens United. Stop creating smokescreens to disguise the central aim of these laws, to limit the political voices of the people. Story 44. United States politicians are available to the highest bidder, whether churches, foreign national billionaires, or any other interested party with a checkbook. Story 45. The stated goal of the current administration and the many groups funding and influencing the current administration is to have a religious government, a Christian nation. This is called Christian nationalism. The goal is to have one cultural identity for everyone. They do not want a line drawn. Look at the language they are using now. Hegseth and Johnson have both started repeating, "Your rights come from God, not the law." Story 46. Soon, we will no longer have separation of church and state. Demolishing this separation has long been one of certain extremist groups' goals, and they are close to achieving it. The legal efforts to dismantle the current separation of church and state have been underway for several years. Few Americans realize that the government we have now is, in fact, a fascist theocracy, and that is how they want it for the time being. Story 47. In the United States, tax-exempt religious organizations are not allowed to endorse political candidates. Story 48. This subreddit has really become, let's discuss today's political topic. You can draw the line where it is drawn in most of the world's secular states. Separation of church and state should respect a few basic principles. Laws are not dictated or justified by religious imperatives. The state holds no official religion and guarantees freedom of religion. The church does not hold responsibility over state matters, such as reporting deaths and births. Story 49. Essentially, government cannot be trusted to make proper decisions regarding religion, which involves protecting people and their beliefs. Many try to take advantage of this, but if the government were to act against them, it would inevitably be used to silence many others. Additionally, an organization taking a political stance does not make it the government. In summary, no line should be drawn, at least not concerning your question. Story 50. This is already supposed to be the law in the United States. Under the Johnson Amendment, tax-exempt organizations classified as 501(c)(3), which include churches, are explicitly prohibited from endorsing or opposing political candidates. The real issue is not whether this should be the rule, but that the Internal Revenue Service very rarely enforces it. Story 51. Religious organizations are non-profit organizations. All non-profit organizations are allowed to endorse political candidates and retain their tax-exempt status. Story 52. The country was founded on Judeo-Christian ethics. That is why our country sought to be free from Europe. There will always be a connection. Story 53. The whole point of Donald Trump and Project 2025 is to remove the line. This is part of how autocracy and dictators come to power. Use religion as a weapon, control all branches of government unchecked, end higher education and any intellectualism, destroy the free press and science communication, begin disappearing anyone who is not in their image of what a citizen should be, and so on. This is not new. It has been the playbook for thousands of years. Some of us have been warning about this for 50 years, but no one wanted to pay attention. Could never happen here. When the January 6th attack was brushed under the table by the Republican Party, it should have been the wake-up call for everyone. It was not, and the traitor was re-elected. What did people think was going to happen? Story 54. Where do we draw the line between corporations and government? Stop being a bigot and try thinking your thoughts through. Story 55. Depending on who you ask, There should not be a line. I do not talk to those people, however. They do not like it when I point out that the First Amendment mentions religion first and separately from the right to free speech. Story 56. If we followed our Constitution, we should not allow it, in my opinion, but I am not the Supreme Court of the United States. The line between religion and government should be clear, but the line between religion and politics is clearly not. Story 57. The answer in the current government is simple. As long as they support the Republican Party, it is acceptable, but the moment they try to support anyone else, they will be treated as foreign enemies and eliminated. Story 58. Legally, they cannot. But the line between church and state is ideological, not financial. The financial aspect is historical and predates the founding of the country. In England, churches were not taxed because they were a separate authority. No one dared to challenge the Pope. Money raised by the church was assumed to be used for the common good and support of the orphaned and indigent. It was, in a way, a social safety net. That sense of obligation carried over in the founding of the states. The separation of church and state, coming from James Madison but echoed by all the founders, was originally based on the tenets of the Enlightenment, an enormously popular philosophy of its day. The Enlightenment declared that man was subject to no authority to which he did not consent. He was sovereign in his own right and not a subject of any king or religious leader. The logical extension of that is that religion has a place in the voluntary choice of man but no place in the rule or subjugation of the nation. You have to remember these men were well aware of the conflicts created by the Holy Roman Empire. Freedom of assembly and worship is your choice to make. And sure, no taxes on those institutions that are doing, in theory, God's work and a greater good. But that is it. Stay out of politics for very obvious reasons. Of course, there are those who do not respect the intention and function of that line and cross it anyway. Part of the reason it is being crossed is because the Republican Party, having an unwinnable position being in the minority vote count-wise, pursued the Southern churches with zeal. They had large mailing databases they were willing to sell. These people were predominantly conservative. They were conditioned to providing financial support for their causes. With properly framed messaging, such as appeals to God and country or Christian soldier themes, you could provoke a response and secure a very loyal and reliable vote. All you had to do was label the Democrats as unethical, immoral, or baby killers. It worked like a charm. But the Republican Party itself could not care less. It will wrap itself in God, country, virtue signaling, patriotism, veterans, and family values. But all that is for show. In Congress, they are as corrupt, immoral, and unethical as any group. They will put on the occasional show of being on the high road, but most of the time they seek power and money. Story 59. The problem is not religious organizations donating. It is just a subset. The problem is citizens united. We can scapegoat and say that churches endorsing political candidates is bad. But when you realize most religious institutions that do this already operate like a business, the problem is much larger in scale. It is important to understand the full problem rather than target small parts of it. Story 60. Who still goes to church anyway? The last couple of times I went, there were maybe 5 to 10 elderly people aged 80 and above, 3 to 4 families with children eating snacks during the service and spilling it all over the carpet, and a couple of older unmarried women. There was barely a congregation to speak of and no choir. If that is their target political audience, I am actually okay with it. However, they absolutely should be taxed. Story 61. But religious organizations cannot endorse political candidates without losing their tax-exempt status. Can they? At least not those in the United States. Am I missing something? Story 62. What we should do is recognize that you cannot have freedom of religion without also having freedom from religion. In other words, no one should be able to impose their religious beliefs onto others because doing so violates their religious freedom. If that means removing politicians who hide behind the Bible or any other religious text to justify their harmful policies, so be it. It also means that religious organizations should be barred from participating in politics in any way. Since that is unlikely to happen, what we really ought to do is remove the tax-exempt status from all churches and let them claim deductions for any actual charitable work they do. If they are doing as much good as they claim, There will be no functional difference beyond having to pay accountants like any other business. Story 63. Conservative Christians do not believe in the separation of church and state, and they have a loyal voter base that has been emboldened. Drawing a line between religion and government is not realistic right now, unless the faith is anything other than Christianity. Story 64. I think they are only talking about members of the Republican Party and Christians. I look forward to anyone else trying it. Story 65. It is allowed for religion to influence government policy decisions, but the government cannot take any negative actions against the primary religion of the country. At least that is how it appears to work. Story 66. Public sector labor unions have been doing it all along. I do not see any real difference between a teacher labor union promoting and donating to candidates or a church doing the same. Story 67. There is no boundary other than to keep the government out of religion. Don't like it? Try to change the Constitution. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.